February 26, 1991. A sandstorm the color of dried blood swallows the Iraqi desert near a map coordinate the Americans have started calling 73 Easting. Visibility is down to a few hundred meters. Rain mixes with grit. And somewhere inside that brown murk, dug into reverse slope positions and sand berms, sit the tanks of Iraq's Tawakalna division, the best the Republican Guard had, equipped with Soviet-built T-72s, the same machines Moscow's own crews trained on from the Fulda Gap to the steppes of Kazakhstan. Their gunners were waiting. They knew the Americans were coming. They had ranged their guns, set their kill zones, and done exactly what Soviet doctrine, written in Moscow, taught across the Warsaw Pact, told them to do. Then the horizon opened up. American M1A1 Abrams tanks came out of the storm at 30 miles an hour, and the first thing the Iraqis learned was that the Abrams could see them when they could not see the Abrams. The thermal sights cut through the sandstorm like it wasn't there. Iraqi rounds, fired at the muzzle flashes, struck the front of the American tanks and skipped off the special armor. And the Abrams kept coming. They fired on the move, a thing Soviet doctrine said was nearly impossible to do accurately, and they did not miss. In 23 minutes, a single American cavalry troop destroyed an entire Iraqi brigade, not damaged, destroyed. In the months that followed, as the smoke cleared and the Pentagon counted the wreckage, a quieter reckoning began thousands of miles away. Inside the Soviet General Staff, inside the armor design bureaus at Nizhny Tagil, inside the minds of the men who had spent 40 years building the tanks that were supposed to win the next war in Europe, what they wrote in their classified after-action assessments, what their analysts concluded about the machine that had just butchered their best export, amounted to something close to a confession. The phrase that comes down to us, attributed to Soviet and post-Soviet armor analysts studying the gun camera footage and the burned-out hulks, captures it. The American tank, they said, did not stop. This is the story of how a tank that Congress nearly canceled, a tank derided through the 1980s as overpriced, overweight, and over-engineered, a tank that critics swore would break down in the desert, became the instrument that, in 100 hours, demolished the central assumption of Soviet military power. The assumption that quantity would beat quality, that a flood of cheap, rugged Soviet steel would simply overwhelm whatever the decadent West could field. Desert Storm was not fought against the Soviet Union. By February 1991, the USSR was months from vanishing into history, but it was fought against Soviet doctrine, Soviet equipment, Soviet training, and Soviet assumptions, a full dress rehearsal of the World War III that, thank God, never came. And when the Soviet military looked at the results, they saw their own future death certificate written in the sand. How did America build this thing? How did it nearly throw it away? And why did the men in Moscow, watching from the wreckage of their own collapsing empire, conclude that the entire balance of the Cold War had rested on a bluff the Abrams had just called? To understand what happened at 73 Easting, you have to go back past the desert, past Saddam Hussein, to a decision made in the gray bureaucratic corridors of the Pentagon in the 1970s, when a defeated, demoralized, drug-addled American army, fresh from the humiliation of Vietnam, made a bet on a single machine that almost no one believed in. To find the America that built the Abrams, you have to find America at its lowest military ebb of the entire Cold War. It is the mid-1970s. Saigon has fallen, or is about to. The last helicopter is lifting off the embassy roof. The United States Army that comes home from Vietnam is not the confident force that won World War II. It is broken. Heroin use is rampant in the ranks. Racial violence tears through barracks. Discipline has collapsed to the point that officers in Vietnam feared their own men. Fragging, the murder of officers by their own troops, entered the American vocabulary. The draft is ending, deeply unpopular, and the all-volunteer force is an untested gamble. Recruitment is in free fall. The phrase circulating among defense intellectuals is the hollow army. Meanwhile, across the Iron Curtain, the threat has never looked larger. The Soviet Union under Leonid Brezhnev is at the apex of its military power. The Red Army fields tens of thousands of tanks. The doctrine is straightforward and terrifying. Should war come in Europe, waves of Soviet armor would pour through the Fulda Gap into West Germany, echelon after echelon, more tanks than NATO could possibly kill before they reached the Rhine. American and West German planners did the math and did not like the answer. Outnumbered perhaps 3-1 in armor, NATO's stated fallback was chilling: tactical nuclear weapons. If we cannot stop them with conventional forces, we go nuclear. and we pray it stays limited. Détente, the watchword of the Nixon and Ford years, was supposed to ease this. Kissinger's grand design of linkage and arms control, SALT I, the ABM Treaty, sought to manage the competition rather than win it. But on the ground in Europe, the conventional balance kept tilting east. The 1973 Yom Kippur War sent a shockwave through the Pentagon. In that conflict, modern Soviet-supplied anti-tank missiles shredded Israeli armor, and tank losses on both sides were staggering, faster than anyone had imagined possible. American officers studying the battle realized that their own tank, the M60 Patton, a reliable but aging design, might not survive a high-intensity European war. Into this gloom walked a generation of reformers determined to rebuild the army from the studs. General William Dupuy and the new Training and Doctrine Command rewrote how America would fight. The doctrine that emerged, eventually called Air-Land Battle, rejected the idea of simply trading nukes. It argued America could win conventionally by fighting smarter, hitting the Soviet rear echelons, seizing the initiative, fighting at night and in weather, and fielding weapons so qualitatively superior that they could offset Soviet numbers. That doctrine needed tools. 5 of them, the Army decided, the Big 5 weapons programs that would define American land power for the next half-century. The Apache attack helicopter, the Black Hawk utility helicopter, the Patriot air defense missile, the Bradley fighting vehicle, and at the center of it all, a new main battle tank. It was a colossal bet at the worst possible moment. A post-Vietnam Congress, sick of defense spending, skeptical of the brass, looking to cut budgets, was being asked to fund the most expensive tank in history. Inflation was savage. The economy was stagnant. Watergate had shredded public trust in the executive branch, and the Army no one respected, was asking America to believe in it again. The tank they wanted did not yet have a name. It would get one, the M1, after Creighton Abrams, the general who had commanded in Vietnam and died in office. And almost from the moment it was conceived, people started trying to kill it. The fight over the Abrams was, at first, a fight inside the Pentagon itself. The Army had tried this before, and failed spectacularly. Through the late 1960s, the United States partnered with West Germany on a joint tank of the future, the MBT-70. It was a marvel of ambition, a high-drop pneumatic suspension that let it crouch and rise, a driver seated in the turret, a gun that could fire missiles. It was also a catastrophe of cost and complexity. The price ballooned past anything Congress would tolerate. In 1971, lawmakers killed it. America had spent years and fortunes and had no new tank to show for it. So when the Army came back, the reformers knew they were on probation. The new program would be managed differently. They created a dedicated task force and put a hard-charging officer, Major General Robert Baer, in charge with a mandate to control cost and schedule. They set a unit cost target and treated it as sacred. And they did something the American defense establishment rarely did gracefully. They held a true competition. 2 contractors, Chrysler and General Motors, each built prototypes and ran them through brutal testing in 1976. Then came the engine fight, which nearly tore the program apart. Chrysler's design used a gas turbine engine, essentially a jet engine adapted to drive a tank. It was smooth, powerful, and quiet enough to earn the tank its later nickname, Whispering Death. But turbines are thirsty, gulping fuel whether idling or racing. Critics were appalled. A tank that drinks like that, they said, will run dry crossing Germany, let alone a desert. GM's diesel was the conservative, sensible choice. The Army agonized, reversed itself, agonized again, and chose the turbine. It was a bet on raw performance over prudence, and it would be argued about for the next 15 years. There was a second fight, quieter and far more secret. The British had developed a revolutionary new kind of armor at their research center at Chobham, a composite layering of steel, ceramics, and other materials that defeated shape-charge warheads far better than steel alone. The Americans got access, adapted it, and built it into the M1. They would later go further, weaving in plates of depleted uranium, denser than steel, brutally effective. The details were classified to the hilt. The men who knew did not talk. This armor would become the Abrams' deepest secret and, in the desert, its salvation. Across the world, the adversary was not standing still. The Soviet design bureaus had their own philosophy, and it was the opposite of the American one. Where the U.S. built a heavy, expensive, crew-protected machine, the Soviets built the T-72, lighter, cheaper, simpler, and producible in staggering numbers. Its autoloader meant a crew of 3 instead of 4. Its profile was low and hard to hit. It was, by design, expendable in a way no American would accept, because Soviet doctrine assumed it would be expended, that mass, not finesse, would carry the day. The T-72 was exported across the world. The AK-47 of tanks, the iron fist of the Warsaw Pact and its clients. One of those clients was a rising strongman in Baghdad named Saddam Hussein. By 1980, the first M1 Abrams rolled off the line at the Lima Army tank plant in Ohio. It weighed nearly 60 tons. It cost a fortune. And the moment it entered service, the critics, in Congress, in the press, in the defense reform movement, sharpened their knives. They had numbers, they had test reports, and they were about to put the Abrams on trial in the court of American public opinion. The campaign to kill the Abrams in the early 1980s was led not by doves, but by a band of contrarian insiders who called themselves the military reform movement. They were a strange and formidable coalition. Air Force Colonel John Boyd, the fighter pilot theorist, defense analyst Pierre Sprey, congressional staffers, sympathetic journalists, and a young Colorado congressman named Gary Hart, who would carry their banner on Capitol Hill. Their critique was sweeping. American weapons, they argued, had become too complex, too expensive, too fragile, gold-plated machines that looked dazzling in a brochure and would fail in the mud and chaos of real war. The Abrams was their Exhibit A. Their charges were specific and damaging. The turbine engine was a fuel hog that would strangle its own supply lines. The tank was too heavy for many of Europe's bridges. Its early reliability numbers in testing were poor. It kept breaking down, throwing tracks, suffering engine failures. Dust ruined the engine filters. The price, critics thundered, could buy several simpler tanks for every one Abrams. Why, they asked, build a handful of exquisite tanks when the Soviets would drown you in cheap ones? The press piled on. The Abrams became a recurring punchline in the broader 1980s narrative of Pentagon waste. The same era that gave America the $640 toilet seat and the $7,000 coffee maker, stories that enraged taxpayers and embarrassed the Reagan defense buildup. To a public already primed to believe the military couldn't manage money, a fragile, gas-guzzling, budget-busting super tank fit the story perfectly. Inside the Army, the pressure was immense. Careers rode on the program, reputations were staked, and here the institution did something genuinely impressive. Instead of hiding the failures, it attacked them. The Army poured effort into reliability. Engineers redesigned the air filtration system. The desert dust problem that critics seized on became a fixation of the engineering teams. They refined the engine, the transmission, the tracks. They tested obsessively, logging tens of thousands of miles, hunting down every failure mode. Then they made the machine even more lethal. The original M1 carried a 105mm gun, a good weapon, but, the Army judged, not enough for the threat coming out of Soviet factories. So they upgraded to a 120mm smoothbore, a German-designed cannon, license-built in America, that could punch through any armor the Soviets were likely to field. They added the depleted uranium armor. They improved the thermal sights until an Abrams crew could see and kill in total darkness, in smoke, in sandstorms, the conditions that historically had blinded tanks and slowed armored war to a crawl. This upgraded version, the M1A1, entered service in 1985, and almost no one outside the Army believed it would work. The reform critique had sunk into the public mind. The reputation was set. The Abrams was a boondoggle waiting to be exposed. When skeptics imagined the tank in real combat, they imagined breakdowns and burning hulks, and a generation of generals explaining to Congress how they'd wasted billions. What none of them could have known, what no congressional hearing or magazine exposé could have predicted, was that history was about to run the experiment for real, not in the forests of Germany against the Red Army, but in a place almost perfectly designed to expose every weakness the critics had named: heat, endless dust, fuel lines stretched across hundreds of miles of open desert. On August 2, 1990, Saddam Hussein's Soviet-equipped army rolled into Kuwait, and the most criticized tank in American history was about to get its trial by fire. The buildup was called Desert Shield, and for 6 months it was mostly waiting, 500,000 Americans pouring into Saudi Arabia, and the Abrams baking in exactly the heat and grit its critics swore would destroy it. It didn't. The reliability work paid off. The tanks ran. Crews trained relentlessly in the open desert, learning to navigate a featureless landscape with a new tool just coming into service: GPS, the satellite positioning system that would let armored columns find their way across trackless sand at night. In storms, with no landmarks at all, the Iraqis had no equivalent. It was one of a dozen invisible American advantages stacking up unseen. The ground war opened February 24, 1991. After 38 days of air bombardment that had pounded Iraqi forces, General Norman Schwarzkopf launched his left hook, a massive armored sweep far to the west, swinging around the Iraqi defenses to trap the Republican Guard against the Kuwaiti border. The American VII Corps, the Armored Fist, drove into Iraq. Then came the weather the critics had warned about, and it became the Abrams' greatest stage. February 26th, a howling sandstorm reduced visibility to almost nothing. Into that storm rode the 2nd Armored Cavalry Regiment, scouting ahead of the Corps. At a map line called the 73 Easting, they ran headlong into the dug-in Tawakalna Division, the Republican Guard's best, in prepared positions, waiting. What followed became legend at Fort Benning and Fort Knox. Captain H.R. McMaster, yes, the same officer who would one day sit in the White House as National Security Advisor, led Eagle troops straight into the Iraqi line. His 9 Abrams crested a rise and found themselves staring at dug-in T-72s at point-blank range. McMaster's gunner fired. The first T-72 exploded. In the next minutes, Eagle Troops' 9 tanks destroyed dozens of Iraqi vehicles without losing a single one of their own. This was the pattern, repeated up and down the front. The Abrams thermal sights saw through the sandstorm. The Iraqis, peering into the brown void, often never saw what killed them. The American 120mm guns reached out and destroyed T-72s well beyond the range at which the Iraqi guns could even hope to penetrate the Abrams frontal armor. And when Iraqi rounds did strike home, and they did dozens of times, the Chobham and uranium armor held. T-72 shells gouged the Abrams and skidded away. The crews inside felt the impact and kept fighting. The most haunting detail came from the after-action reports. Iraqi tanks, hit by American sabot rounds, had their turrets blown clean off, flipping through the air in a phenomenon gunners grimly nicknamed the Jack-in-the-Box effect. The T-72's autoloader, with its ammunition stored in the crew compartment, detonating in a single catastrophic blast. The very design choices that made the T-72 cheap and low and numerous made it a coffin when the armor was pierced. At 73 Easting, at Medina Ridge, at Norfolk, wherever American and Iraqi armor met, the result was the same lopsided slaughter. In the Battle of Medina Ridge, an American division destroyed some 60 Iraqi tanks in less than an hour and lost essentially nothing in return. American tank crews reported the eerie experience of fighting a war in which the enemy could barely touch them. 100 hours after it began, the ground war was over, Kuwait was free, and the most criticized tank in American history had not merely survived its trial, it had delivered one of the most one-sided armored victories ever recorded. It would dishonor the dead to pretend this victory was free or that the Abrams was invincible. It was neither. The hard truth, absorbed quietly inside the Army, was that the most dangerous threat to an Abrams in the Gulf War was another Abrams. In the chaos of fast-moving battle, in sandstorms and at night, American crews sometimes fired on their own. Friendly fire, fratricide, accounted for a painful share of American armored losses and deaths. Several Abrams were knocked out not by Iraqi guns but by American sabot rounds and Hellfire missiles fired by aircraft and other tanks that misidentified them in the murk. For the families of those men, the lopsided victory statistics meant nothing. Their sons died on the winning side of the most one-sided battle of the era, killed by their own. This became its own object of study. The Army poured resources into combat identification systems, thermal panels, beacons, anything to keep Americans from killing Americans. The very speed and lethality that made the Abrams so devastating had created a new battlefield problem. When you can kill anything you see at 2 miles in the dark through a sandstorm, you had better be absolutely certain what you're shooting at. The broader American cost of the Gulf War was, by the standards of the Cold War's hot wars, mercifully small. Fewer than 150 Americans died in combat, a number that stood in staggering contrast to the 58,000 lost in Vietnam, a war that still haunted every general who planned this one. That was, in fact, much of the point. Colin Powell, chairman of the Joint Chiefs, had insisted on overwhelming force precisely to avoid the slow bleed of Vietnam. The doctrine that bore his name, overwhelming force, clear objectives, decisive victory, rapid exit, was Vietnam's ghost made into policy. But there were costs that didn't show up in casualty lists. There was the unsettling discovery of Iraqi tank crews incinerated in their vehicles, the grim images of the highway of death where retreating Iraqi forces were destroyed from the air, images that prompted a queasy debate in Washington about when a rout becomes a massacre, and contributed to President Bush's decision to halt the war after 100 hours, leaving Saddam Hussein in power. That decision would haunt American policy for a generation. And there was the later, lingering cost, Gulf War illness, the cluster of unexplained ailments that afflicted tens of thousands of veterans, its causes, burning oil wells, experimental vaccines, low-level chemical exposure, debated for years in a story of veterans fighting their own government for recognition. For the Soviets, the cost was of an entirely different kind. It was the cost of revelation. Soviet and Russian military analysts, studying the destruction of an army equipped almost identically to their own frontline forces, reached a devastating conclusion. The problem was not simply that the export model T-72s sold to Iraq were downgraded monkey models, though they were, and Russian commentators would lean hard on that excuse. The deeper problem was doctrinal. The entire Soviet theory of war, mass, echelons, quantity overwhelming quality, had just been tested by proxy and found catastrophically wanting against a Western force that could see first, shoot first, and kill first, at night, in any weather. The reconnaissance strike complex the Soviet Marshal Nikolai Ogarkov had warned about in the early 1980s, the marriage of sensors, precision, and information that would render mass obsolete, had arrived, and it wore an American flag. The Gulf War ended in late February 1991. The Soviet Union ceased to exist in December of that same year. The two events were not the same, but they were not unrelated either. For a watching world, Desert Storm was a revelation about American power. The hollow army of the 1970s, the broken force that had limped home from Vietnam, was gone. In its place stood a professional, all-volunteer military equipped with weapons. The Abrams, the Apache, the Patriot, the F-117 stealth fighter, precision-guided bombs that operated on a different technological plane than anything an adversary could field. The Big Five bet of the 1970s had paid off beyond the wildest hopes of the men who made it. The reformers who had mocked the Abrams fell silent, or recanted, or were simply overtaken by the footage of T-72 turrets cartwheeling through the air. In American domestic politics, the effect was electric and immediate. President George H.W. Bush's approval ratings rocketed to nearly 90%, among the highest ever recorded. The phrase on every commentator's lips was that America had kicked the Vietnam syndrome. Bush himself said it, "By God, we've kicked the Vietnam syndrome once and for all." The long national self-doubt that had hung over the military since Saigon seemed in 100 hours to lift. It did not last. The same Bush who stood astride the world in March 1991 lost his re-election in November 1992 to a young governor from Arkansas who hammered him on a stagnant economy. It's the economy, stupid. The military triumph, so total, so satisfying, simply could not be converted into domestic political durability. It was a lesson in the limits of even the most complete battlefield victory. The American voter, in the end, cared more about the recession at home than the parade of victory abroad. For the U.S. military, Desert Storm became the template, and, some would later argue, a dangerous one. The combination of overwhelming force, air supremacy, and technological dominance had produced a victory so clean that it created expectations no future war could easily meet. The messy, ambiguous conflicts that followed in the next decades, where the enemy didn't mass conveniently in open desert, where there were no turrets to blow off, would frustrate commanders raised on the memory of 73 Easting. For the armor world, the verdict was permanent. The Abrams had proven that the Western philosophy, quality, crew protection, sensors, the long first shot kill, had decisively beaten the Soviet philosophy of mass. Every serious tank-building nation absorbed the lesson. The age of the cheap, expendable, numerous tank was over. The age of the networked, sensor-rich, heavily protected tank had begun. Even Russia, the inheritor of the Soviet design tradition, would spend the next 30 years trying to answer the questions Desert Storm had posed, and, as later wars would reveal, struggling to do so. And inside the wreckage of the Soviet collapse, the lesson cut deepest of all. For 40 years, the central nightmare of NATO planning had been the Red Army flood pouring through the Fulda Gap. Desert Storm strongly suggested that flood might have broken on the rocks of Western technology, that the great Soviet armored juggernaut, the thing that had justified trillions in Western defense spending and decades of nuclear brinkmanship, might have been, in a conventional fight against a prepared NATO, far less invincible than anyone in the West had dared to believe. So what does the M1 Abrams really tell us about America and the Cold War it had just won? Start with the machine itself and the institution that built it. The Abrams is the story of an American success that was, at nearly every stage, indistinguishable from failure. A program born of a humiliating earlier cancellation, a tank Congress nearly killed that the press mocked, that a movement of clever insiders insisted was a fragile, gold-plated boondoggle. They were not stupid, those critics. Their concerns about cost and complexity were often fair, but they were wrong about the thing that mattered most, and they were proven wrong not by argument but by results in the only laboratory that counts, which is combat. There's a deeper American lesson buried here, about the peculiar genius of the system that produced the Abrams. It was a system that aired its failures in public, that let critics savage its weapons in open hearings, that argued ferociously about every design choice, and then, under that pressure, fixed the problems. The desert dust that was supposed to kill the engine had been engineered against precisely because critics screamed about it. The reliability that astonished everyone in 1991 existed because the Army had spent a decade being publicly humiliated about its absence. The open society, for all its messiness, built a better tank than the closed one. That is not a small thing to notice about how the Cold War actually ended. And consider the strange, ghostly nature of this victory. Desert Storm was the great tank battle of the Cold War that the Cold War never had. For 40 years, the two superpowers built their armies for a clash on the German plain that everyone feared and no one wanted. That battle was never fought. Instead, in the deserts of Iraq, against a third-rate dictator using second-hand Soviet equipment and Soviet doctrine, America got to see what that apocalyptic European war might have looked like. And the answer, see first, shoot first, kill first, was so lopsided that it retroactively reframed the entire Cold War military competition. The balance of terror, it turned out, may have rested on a Western technological edge far sharper than either side fully understood. The men in Moscow understood it. Watching their export army die in the sand, their analysts grasped that something fundamental had shifted, that the future of war belonged to sensors and precision and information, and that the Soviet system, for all its tanks, had been losing that race for years. The Abrams didn't just defeat the T-72, it helped close the book on an entire theory of war, and on the empire that theory was built to serve. It does not stop, they said of the American tank, and in a sense larger than they meant it, they were right. What didn't stop was the thing the Abrams represented, the relentless American marriage of money, technology, open argument, and institutional stubbornness that had, over 40 years, simply outbuilt the other side. That's the story as I see it, but I want to hear yours. Was the Abrams the weapon that proved Western quality beat Soviet quantity? Or was Desert Storm a fluke, a mismatch against a broken enemy that taught America the wrong lessons for the wars that came after? Drop your verdict in the comments. I read them, and the best ones shape future videos. If this brought the Cold War to life for you, hit that like button and subscribe for more stories from the long twilight struggle, because the past, as always, has more to teach us than we think.